My name is Rupal Ismin, as Joanna mentioned, and I'm calling from Gadigal land here in Sydney on the University of Sydney's campus. I'm, as opposed to the other speakers here, I'm more of a kind of ecosystem builder. So I'm going to tell a little bit of my story of kind of how I got into research commercialization and why it's important before I go into a couple of recommendations. So I am from Chicago. My folks are from India. My husband is Jewish. My daughter was born in New Zealand. My son was born in Sydney. So I feel like I'm really kind of a one-person global Australia network. We can go to the next slide. My career reflects, I guess, those adaptations that I've had to have as I restart myself across these different geographies, which essentially are different economies. All of my work has been in emerging industry. I first started my career in the mid-noughties in digital media, where I was really kind of learning how the internet worked. That brought me to Australia in 2007, and that kind of how to make money from the internet industry was booming, and I was able to take a little bit of risks in my career and launched an e-commerce startup in kind of the early days of the startup ecosystem called Andible back in 2010. Since then, I've been working in operations in very early stages of businesses, including as the general manager of Australia's first network of co-working spaces. I've worked in smart cities and GovTech in San Francisco, had a brief stint in New Zealand, and I moved back to Sydney in 2019, where I live and I call home now. And I work at the University of Sydney. And so what business do I have? This, startup generalist who's worked in a lot of different fields, working at the University of Sydney. So when I was looking to kind of facilitate my role, to facilitate my move back to Australia, the startups that were getting a lot of attention and that were receiving funding were predominantly in fintech businesses and marketplaces. All the stuff that I was interested in, like climate tech and so forth, these were all kind of intellectual property heavy inventions and not just business model innovations. We can go to the next slide. So this data is a couple years old, but I think concisely tells this kind of problem. Australia has great universities. We do very well in basic research, but we do really poorly in terms of translation and commercialization. And who cares? What does it matter? So for me, that mattered back in 2019 because it was hard for me to find a job that I was excited about. I wasn't excited about marketplaces or fintech. No offense to those working in those areas. But it also means that the impact of one of Australia's biggest economic sectors could be much bigger if we invested more in turning these research outcomes into real solutions for these really hard global problems. I think these have major implications for our economy. In terms of kind of moving away from pulling things out of our earth and tourism and so forth. We could really have this robust economy heading in that I think we all kind of see in society. We could attract the smartest people and have some great jobs if we really took advantage of this. So moving on to the next slide, inaugural director of the Sydney Knowledge Hub, which is where I am now. It's an initiative out of the University of Sydney to support research commercialization. We can go to the next slide. We here help drive a culture of commercialization at the University of Sydney. We run a few programs for researchers. We make a lot of connections and guide researchers who want to pursue commercializations. We have a co-working space. So here we have 25 companies, very intellectual heavy, IP heavy companies that work here on the Darlington campus. And that's really helped that kind of ecosystem play for our researchers to be more exposed to, some of these businesses and inventions that are changing the world. We opened in 2019, and we are seeing a big leveling up across research organizations in Australia. University of Melbourne last year kind of announced a $100 million investment fund to invest in these early stage businesses coming from the university. University of New South Wales has a SynBio 10X accelerator program where Main Sequence Ventures, who is CSIRO's venture capital arm, is the major investment partner. So we're all kind of getting excited in this area, but I think we have a far way to go. So the next slide. So why does Australia lag behind in turning our research outputs into market-driven solutions? I think there's kind of four categories of reasons for this. The first one, that I think gets a lot of airtime is the valley of death, which is essentially the time when a researcher has invented something and they are working on kind of the product market fit. They might have had a diagnostic or a coding or something like that, but actually figuring out kind of where the market opportunity lies takes a bit of time. This period, of course, for intellectual property heavy inventions could be very long and is high risk. The science doesn't always work out. And Australia, I think, doesn't do a great job of hyping up these opportunities. And our capital here is not particularly patient. I think this is the most publicized problem, but I think this is partly an effect rather than a cause of some of the underlying issues. The second reason why I think Australia lags behind in terms of research commercialization is our levels of industry engagement. So our levels of businesses, a number of businesses, particularly SMEs collaborating with research organizations, is incredibly low. Germany, the UK have rates 8 to 10 times higher than Australia does. And then, there's all sorts of reasons for this, and this is kind of be a whole separate kind of webinar, but there's IP management issues, our networks are limited, there's different priorities, all these things. But we should be doing better because we see that the ROI on these collaborations are incredibly high. And Australia has really high, some of the best in the world tax incentives to invest in, for companies to invest in research and development. The third reason I think that Australia could have better commercial outputs is because of the reward structures within Australian universities. Historically speaking, particularly a lot of amongst researchers, commercialization is often seen as kind of a dirty word or selling out. The frameworks for promotion within research organizations are around kind of attracting the most, ARC or NHMRC funding and publishing in, in prestigious journals, not around industry engagement and commercialization. So leadership on one hand says that we value it, but it's not necessarily matching the incentive structures that is at school and faculty level. And finally, I think we punch below our weight because, and I think this is, probably the biggest reason is because we have fewer people in our ecosystem. That means, a smaller market for products, which is, I think, part of the reason that we, our venture capital is not as excited about taking as much risk as, potentially, the US market, for example. But we also have fewer sources of inspirations and role models. And also, I think importantly, we have fewer commercialization leads. This topic is kind of near and dear to my heart. Our researchers want to be researchers. We need more kind of people with business acumen, more people who have experience in launching businesses to partner with our researchers to bring these inventions forward. So, but I think change is in the air. We have new demands on our rankings. We have new funding imperatives and opportunities like the Australian Economic Accelerator, which is $1.6 billion specifically from the federal government, specifically meant to address this. We have the National Reconstruction Fund, which is $15 billion in financing areas like defense and green energy and medicine, and new expectations from government and society. So I'm personally very excited to be working in this space because I think we're really at the beginnings of something quite transformational here in Australia.